Action.
Welcome to day 2 in the let's do it again. So what are we going to do here? What is this called? Our lectures on Jacksonian democracy. Day 2 of our lectures on Jacksonian democracy. All right. So anyways, you are going to put those on. It's uploading now on YouTube. So this will be on YouTube. So if anybody misses, missed yesterday, or missed today, or missed tomorrow because of testing, or because, obviously the kids are here, but the people on the band trip, you can view them all on the YouTube site that is on Edline. So if you go on Edline into the links thing, the very bottom one is YouTube. And those are the ones where our review sessions are. So you can access what we're going to talk about today, what we talked about yesterday, and what we'll talk about tomorrow on those sites for our test on Friday. Now, we turned in those rewrites today, and that was one big thing that we had to do. And now the next big thing that we have to do is our test on Friday. Now, our test on Friday is on the nature of Jacksonian democracy and the Jacksonian Democrats. Now, it's going to be an analysis, right? An analysis of a prompt. So the prompt is a question that's going to force you to analyze the nature of the Jacksonian Democrats. Now, the ultimate thing is, and this is widely known, and this is really what you're going to do, there are some people that then and now thought that the Jacksonian Democrats, led by Jackson, were really super duper great. And they had done all of these things that were meritorious and good and advanced the country. And there were other people that violently opposed them and thought that the things that they did weren't so great. And they thought that really these people deceived themselves and the public about how good they actually were. And so the idea is going to be that based on what you know about the era and these people and what occurred, you're going to take a position. And then you're going to use the evidence to defend the position. And see, that's really what we're aspiring to. We're aspiring to get you to be able to use the evidence to defend and explain your position. Now, we didn't really do that on the last essay because we didn't really fully understand the prompt. So in this essay, you should understand the prompt. And what we're going to do is practice doing it the day before. So the day before, on Thursday, we're going to practice here in this room. We're going to draw on the evidence that we have. We're going to look at some issues, and then we're going to say, okay, if we were going to take a position on this issue, what would we say? How could we use this evidence in order to make our point? So then the next day, you're going to do the very same thing about a different question. Right? So that's the idea. Now, in between then and now, what could you do to get ready? Well, the things you could do to get ready is to read chapter 13 in your textbook. In addition to chapter 13 in your textbook, you have all the readings that we gave you, and that would be helpful in preparing. And then on Thursday, we'll kind of experiment with it a little bit, and Friday we'll write the essay. Now, yesterday when we concluded, we had gone through nullification. Right? So we had gone through the entire nullification, crises, and we concluded with this. We said, look, at the end of the crisis ends with a compromise. And the compromise is that tariffs will be reduced over a 10-year period. And South Carolina is willing to accept that. Right? Tariffs will be reduced over a 10-year period. South Carolina accepts that and rescinds their previous nullification. They had nullified the tariff of 28, the tariff of 32. They meet, they rescind that, they accept a reduction in tariffs that occurs. But South Carolina nullifies the force bill. Force bill is irrelevant if they accepted the previous compromise, but that ends the crisis. Now, we debated this. We debated this yesterday. And our debate was who won. Who got the most out of the compromise? And some people thought that South Carolina got the most, some people thought that Jackson got the most. And then, after we debated that a little bit, we talked about whether Jackson made a mistake or whether the country made a mistake in accepting compromise in the first place. Should the issue have been brought to a head? If the issue would have been brought to a head, would the Civil War have been avoided? If Jackson would have held firm, and South Carolina would have been forced to accept the tariffs as they were. And, you know, that South Carolina kind of backs down and no military confrontation occurs, and the idea of nullification is discredited in 32. Would there have been, in 33, would there have been secession in 1860? And so we talked about that a little bit. And I guess what we concluded was this. You know, what South Carolina got out of the nullification compromise was lower tariffs, and they don't surrender their ideology of nullification. So, I mean, you know, they still think they can nullify, they still think they can secede from the Union, and they get lower tariffs. What the Union got, and what Jackson got, was time, right? And you know, it's kind of debatable whether time was valuable or not. I mean, the Union was held together for another 28 years, approximately 30 years. In that time, does the North build its power, influence, industrial base that's going to allow it to endure a civil war when it does come? So this was an interesting conversation, was it not, Frank? An interesting conversation that we had yesterday about that. So now, after we did that, what we did is we went back to the election of 32, right? So listen to the kids go back for the computers at home. That's what we have. It's like a street corner, isn't it? But anyways, after we did the nullification process, we went back to the election of 32. And the reason that, you know, that we went back is because you had to go back. I mean, look, the nullification crisis unfolds in February, in late January and February of 33. By that time, Jackson had already been reelected for his second term. So we went back to that election. We went back to that election and we said that in that election, Jackson is going to represent the Democratic Republicans, and Henry Clay is going to represent the National Republicans, and Clay is going to believe that he's going to easily defeat Jackson because the public will have understood that Jackson is an idiot and Clay is the, you know, is this great statesman, and they will clearly vote for Henry Clay. And Clay and his colleague Daniel Webster are going to try to really expose Jackson's ignorance by forcing the issue of the second bank of the United States. So we talked a little bit about that, and we said, look, the second bank of the United States had been chartered for a 20-year period in 1860. It was due to go out of existence in 1836. But Clay and Webster pushed a bill through Congress in the summer of 32, rechartering the bank early, hoping that Jackson would veto it. And if Jackson vetoed it, that would expose him to the country as being kind of stupid. And that would help Clay to get elected. Well, Jackson does veto the second bank of the United States, but it doesn't help Clay to get elected. Jackson wins easily in 32. And, you know, we talked a little bit about that. But we also said in that election of 32 that a third party emerged, the anti-Mason party. And we talked a little bit about the anti-Mason. We talked a little bit about the Masons. You know, this kind of quasi-secret religious sort of, you know, fraternal organization that people were suspicious of, and, you know, how this, you know, kind of generated this anti-Mason party. But the big point was not the Masons itself. The big point was that the anti-Mason party was the first party to hold a special nominating convention. And a nominating convention becomes the process that every political party is going to use to name candidates for the presidency. And we said that this convention was part of a larger trend that was occurring in this time period, and that we could describe as the rise of the common man in politics. And that's what we concluded yesterday. We concluded yesterday by saying, look, the anti-Masons kind of, pioneering a convention gives the common people more say-so in who will represent their party in the presidential election. And this idea of giving the people more influence over government and over power is a part of what becomes known as Jacksonian democracy or popular democracy. The rise of the common man means that the people have more say-so, wider participation and more say-so in government, right? Sometimes we describe this as an increase in democracy. Now, I want to pause for a second and do a little vocabulary regarding that. When we talk about an increase in democracy, if you thought about it, but I'm sure you wouldn't, but if you did, you would think, well, gee, I mean, either you have a democracy or you don't. You know, the democracy, the idea of the democracy is that the people rule. Right? So how can you have more democracy? You know, I mean, that doesn't really kind of make sense. Well, the problem to some extent is that we use the word democracy and republic, Republican government and democratic government, synonymously. So we say this all the time. We say, after all, we live in a democracy, right? Don't we? Well, the answer is actually no, we don't live in a democracy. We live in a republic, right? And there's a difference. So what we have in the United States from the time the Constitution was established until today is a Republican government. Now, you might say, well, dear instructor, what's the difference between a republic and a democracy? Now, I should tell you that there are a lot of people that are very conscious of this, that are very interested in making sure that kids know the difference between Republican government and democracy. You know, our friends on the right wing are going to stress this. Look, we don't live in a democracy, we live in a republic. Here's the difference. Let me give you an analogy. Let's say that we decided in this room that we were going to get pizza. We said, the heck with it, you know, we're going to get pizza, and everyone is going to throw in $5, and we're going to decide where to get it from. Even Skladany back there is going to participate in getting the pizza, right? You know, so we're going to get the pizza from somewhere. All right, where are we going to get it from? Well, we're going to decide as a class. Everybody's going to vote. We're going to put it up on a board. We're going to put all the pizza places up on the board. We're going to vote. We're going to keep voting. And you people directly decide by majority rule where we're going to get the pizza. That's a democracy. The people made the direct decision. In a republic, what we would do is elect 3 people to make the decision. So we say, okay, how are we going to make the decision as to what pizza we're going to get? Well, we're going to take a vote, but we're not going to vote on what pizza. We're going to vote on what people are going to make that decision. We're going to vote that these 3 people are going to make, they're going to win the election, and these 3 people now are going to be our representatives, and they're going to make the decision. That's Republican government. Republican government is not when the people directly rule, but Republican government is when the people elect their representatives who rule. Now, that's a significant difference, right? That's a difference. Now, a Republican government can become more democratic, right? So we can increase the amount of democracy in a Republican government. So a Republican government can become more democratic if the people have more influence over their elected representatives. That's what happens during this time period. What happens in this time period, this era of Jacksonian democracy, is that the people have more influence over their elected representatives. They have more influence over their elected representatives. They participate more widely in the political process. So we kind of refer to this as an expansion of democracy, right? Now, how do they have more influence? Well, one way is by the convention system. Another way is something called universal white manhood suffrage. Universal white manhood suffrage. And universal white manhood suffrage refers to wider enfranchisement. Enfranchisement refers to the people who can vote. Wider enfranchisement means that more people are eligible to vote. And universal white manhood suffrage means that any white male, age 21 or older, became eligible to vote in this time period. State after state after state, Kromka, changed their voting regulations to allow anybody, any white male, who was 21 years of age or older to be eligible to vote. Up until this time, you had to own property. Right? So unless you owned property, you had to be a white male, but you had to own property. I shouldn't even say that. What's interesting about this is, up until the Jacksonian era, where the common man, if they were white and 21, could not vote. Right? Prior to that, you had to own a certain level of property to be eligible to vote. But what's interesting is that when there was a property requirement for voting, African Americans that held that level of property could vote. Right? So black people could vote if they owned property. You might say, well, how many black people own property? Well, some. Even in the South, if black people, free blacks owned property, they were eligible to vote. When state after state after state eliminated property requirements for voting and instituted what became known as universal white manhood suffrage, they also disenfranchised African Americans entirely. And pretty much only in a few New England states could black people vote. Right? And no women were eligible to vote anywhere. So yeah, I mean, there's this, and that's the tension. The tension that you'll write about on Friday is the tension between, okay, on some level there is this expansion of democracy. More white males could vote, but on another level there is this disenfranchisement, of black males. So what did happen in Jacksonian democracy? So what universal white manhood suffrage is one thing. The convention system to select presidential candidates is another. Judges having to be elected is another thing that happened. Electors to the electoral college. This is the first time that you have legitimate popular participation in presidential elections, right? Where people actually feel that they're voting for the president. Because state after state instituted, elections to determine what electors would cast their ballots in the electoral college, who they supported. And you had wide participation in politics. People, in larger numbers went to the polls, they voted, they participated in political campaigns. Modern electioneering, as we know it today, really comes into their own in this time period where we identify this as being one of the trends, the rise of the common man in politics. So we see this in the 32 election, we see it in the 36 election. In fact, we start to see it as early as when Jefferson is elected in 1800. And Jefferson is the ideological father of this. Jefferson is the one that said that the people are capable of governing themselves. Well, if the people are capable of governing themselves, then increased democracy in a Republican government would be okay. And Jackson is the champion of the common man who wants to be seen as the symbol of this, and his followers are promoting this. So we see this kind of movement in this time period. Now, all right, let's go back to Jackson real quickly. Jackson is elected in 32, and obviously in 33 he's got to deal with nullification. But the big issue in Jackson's second term is the second Bank of the United States. Now, I know what you are thinking. I know you are thinking, well, dear instructor, just a moment ago you said that Jackson vetoed the legislation that would have rechartered the bank. So why was it a big issue? Well, the reason that the second Bank of the United States was a big issue was because even though Jackson had vetoed the legislation rechartering the second Bank of the United States, the bank still had 3 or 4 years to go. It would not formally go out of existence until 36, right? Clay forced the issue in 32, but the bank still had 3 more years of life. Now, what Jackson was afraid of, because he hated the second Bank of the United States, and what he was afraid of was that somehow its president, Nicholas Biddle, would use his influence to somehow get the bank rechartered again. So Jackson determined that he would kill the second Bank of the United States before it died naturally. And the way that he was going to do it is by pulling the government's money out of the bank. Now, the second Bank of the United States gained its strength from having the deposits of the federal government in it. And what Jackson determined he was going to do is pull the government's money out. The problem that Jackson had was even the president cannot touch the money of the federal government. Then and now. The only person that is authorized by the Constitution to touch the funds of the United States government is the Secretary of Treasury. the Secretary of Treasury is responsible for collecting all the revenues that come into the government and expending them all. He's the only person, he or she is the only person that can do it. If you received it, even today, if you received a check from the federal government, it would be signed by the Secretary of Treasury. When Mrs. Kolar receives a big income tax refund from the federal government, thousands of dollars, right? It will be signed by the Secretary of Treasury. Now, obviously, it's not a signature, you know, I mean, it's a stamp. But, you know, I mean, that's the thing. So what Jackson had to do is he had to order the Secretary of Treasury to withdraw funds from the Second Bank of the United States. Secretary of Treasury at the time was his buddy, refused to do so. So I won't do it. Won't do it. I refuse. I quit. So Jackson's own friend, rather than withdraw funds from the Second Bank of the United States, resigned. He said, I won't do it. It's reckless. It's be damaging to the economy, the business community. I'm not even sure it's constitutional. Won't do it. He quit. The Undersecretary of State, Jackson ordered him to do it. He said, I won't do it. I quit. Not Secretary of State, Secretary of Treasury. I quit. So two people refused to take Jackson's order and move this money, and they resigned. Well, this is like really controversial. You know, what Jackson then did is appoint a guy named Roger B. Taney, T-A-N-E-Y, Roger B. Taney, to be Secretary of State. Roger B. Taney. He appointed him to be Secretary of State, and he ordered him now to withdraw the money from the bank. Now, Taney is going to do it, but in a back door way. What Taney does is he doesn't take any government money out of the Second Bank. He just doesn't put any new money in. So what this does is starve the Second Bank of the United States. So he just withdraws from the bank normally, you know, to pay bills, but doesn't deposit any new money in. What he does at Jackson's orders is he deposits any new money in various private banks that are owned by people who support Jackson, who the press called the pet banks. Now, the president of the Second Bank of the United States, and I confess, you know, this whole discussion of banking is complicated, right? Frank is very lucky because he has me for econ, and we're going to learn all about banking. Kromke, you're also very lucky. Tim, you're lucky also. Kaylee, you're lucky because and Musa, remember last year when we talked about it, how much you enjoyed it? Yeah. So banking is very complicated. I understand that. You know, you know. So we try to explain this in a manner that's, you know, sort of understandable. But when Jackson, you know, withdraws that money or doesn't deposit any more money into the Bank of the United States, the Bank of the United States president decides that he's going to try to put pressure on Jackson by taking money out of the economy, by calling back loans. And this causes really a kind of a decline. The economy starts to decline. You know, the business community goes to Jackson and they say, hey, look, you know, do something. And he says, go to Nicholas Biddle. I'm not doing anything. Go to Nicholas Biddle. And they do. And Nicholas Biddle relents, and the pet banks start to make loans, and they make loans out to people that buy land. Land prices go up, and people borrow, municipalities, states borrow to do internal improvements, and the boom, or excuse me, the bust turns out to be a boom. So really, by 1836, the economy is booming. Now, the problem was that Jackson didn't like it. Because what Jackson did not like is paper money, right? Paper money. This is a replica of a banknote from the Second Bank of the United States. And what's interesting is that when banks make loans, they create money. They create money. Now, we don't really see that today, but in the early 19th century, they actually created money, banknotes, right? And those banknotes would circulate as money. This is a banknote from the Second Bank of the United States. And, you know, okay, the Second Bank of the United States would make loans, would create money, these banknotes would circulate. And really, the money I have in my pocket, I have this, this money in my pocket, these are banknotes from the Third Bank of the United States. They circulate as being accepted money now, right? And these banknotes were backed by the faith people had in that bank, and these banknotes are based on the faith that people have on the federal government and the Second Bank of the United States. If you knew that this dollar was only really backed by the belief that you think it's worth a dollar, right? And nothing really more than that, it might terrify you. If you understood the fragile nature of currency and banking, it might. Remember when we talked about that in economics, how terrified you were, right? By you see, he is still filled with terror over our conversation of banking. But back to Jackson. Jackson just doesn't like paper money. He doesn't like it, doesn't trust it, doesn't like banks. And so, unknowingly, I guess, unwittingly, Jackson perpetuated, all this paper money, right? And so, what he does prior to leaving office in 1937 is he gets Congress to issue something called the Species Circular. And the Species Circular says that, look, no longer will the federal government accept paper money as a payment for land in the West. Whoa, well this was a big blow. I mean, the federal government was basically saying, give us gold, give us silver, but don't give us paper money. That had a debilitating effect on all paper money and really may have contributed to what became known as the Panic of 1937. The Panic of 1937 was a terrible economic recession that occurred in the summer of 1837. There's a debate as to whether or not the Species Circular, contributed to this, caused it, contributed it, made it worse, exacerbated it. That's a big discussion. But certainly, the Species Circular, on some level, had to contribute to it. Whether it caused it is maybe debatable. There are other arguments as to what caused it. But it does, there is this terrible panic, and this panic, is an economic downturn. Banks fail, businesses fail, people are unemployed, people are hungry, there are riots over food in the streets, and it's bad times. Jackson never really suffers politically from this because he's gone. He retires in 1836. Jackson was 70 years old in 1836. No one thought that he would live out his first term. He lived it out. No one really thought he'd live out his second term. He lived it out. Now he's still alive. He's too old and sick to run for re-election. Incidentally, he lives 9 more years, right, after that. So they have him dead almost 20 years before that. He lived 9 more years. But anyways, Jackson is going to handpick his successor. And his handpicked successor is Martin Van Buren. Oh my goodness, Olivia, I wish we had more time. I wish we had more time to talk about Martin Van Buren because he's a really interesting and important fellow. He's very influential in this time period. He was at Jackson's side. He was Jackson's Secretary of State. He now was Jackson's Vice President. He's a really powerful political figure from the state of New York. Van Buren is easily nominated by they call themselves just the Democrats. The Democratic Republican Party just changed their name to the Democratic Party. So the Democratic Republicans are the Democrats. They nominate Martin Van Buren. The National Republicans changed their name to the Whigs. The Whig Party had historically been the party in England that opposed the king. And ironically, Andrew Jackson, who is considered to be this champion of democracy, his critics accused him of being a monarch. Here is a famous cartoon of Jackson on the throne there, right? And this is you can see there's King Andrew the First. What if I were a good teacher? Mrs. Buller, if I was a good teacher, I'd have a big picture of this if I were a good teacher for the kids to see passing around, and the kids would look at it and touch it and feel it, maybe roll in it. Kinesthetically, they would roll in it, they would touch it, and how much they would know then, would they not? But no, all I have is this little tiny picture. King Andrew the First. So King Andrew the First is what his critics called us, so the opposition was the Whigs. And the Whig Party was made up of just people that hated Jackson. sometimes they were slightly different politically, but they, they just all unified in hatred of Jackson. And they nominated 3 guys. Their strategy was, okay, we're going to nominate 3 people. Each person will beat Van Buren in their respective regions of the country. And then nobody will get the electoral majority, will go in the House of Representatives and will have a chance there. Well, Van Buren beats all 3 guys, and he is elected to the presidency in 36. But Van Buren's presidency is very, very lackluster. It's very lackluster. And the reason is, too, right? One is Van Buren can never compare to Jackson. I mean, Jackson was this charismatic and beloved general that, had all this forced personality and power and influence. And Van Buren was just, seen as his lackey. The other thing is that you have the Panic of 37. I mean, throughout Van Buren's entire administration, the economy was in bad times. I mean, it didn't recover until after he left office. So Van Buren is constantly battling, these bad times. Now, and these bad times set the stage for the Whigs to elect somebody in 40. The election of 1840 is an interesting one. It kind of represents the common man coming to full, influence. If we say, well, look, the rise of the common man is one of the things that's happening in this time period. The election of 1840, the common man is fully involved. 80% of eligible voters cast ballots in the election of 1840. 80%. It's the highest voter turnout ever in American history, right? It's kind of interesting. You think of that, 80% of eligible voters casting ballots, and in modern elections, maybe it's 60%. And it's hard for us to conceive of that. So I personally don't know anybody that didn't vote in the 2012 presidential election. I don't know anybody. I mean, like, nobody that I know didn't vote. Now, I suppose there were lots of people that didn't vote, in that election. Even something that is so encompassing as a presidential election. So, but it's 80% in 1840. And the election in 1840 represents sort of modern electioneering. The 2 candidates that were there, there were massive campaigns, and placards and posters and buttons and slogans and songs and meetings and all the things that we attribute to modern politicking really had come to fruition. But what's interesting is this. What both candidates wanted to argue, and if you think about what we just said, it's the rise of the common man in politics, right? What both candidates are going to argue in 1840 is that they were common men. Now, neither one of them still campaigned for themselves. Nobody's still campaigning for themselves. But their surrogates argued that they were both common men. William Henry Harrison is a common man, right? Martin Van Buren is a common man. He's no elitist, right? He's no, highfalutin elitist that has, an expensive education. He's just he's just like us. So we should elect him to be the president. Now, this is an interesting kind of phenomenon that I would argue no one would ever apply in any other circumstance. No one would ever say, if I had to have brain surgery, what I want is a common man to be my brain surgeon. Right? I want someone that's just like me. I don't want someone with an expensive and extensive education to be my brain. You would say, well, that's absolutely ridiculous. I mean, if I would have a brain surgeon, I want anybody but a common man to cut my head open, right? I want somebody who's an elitist, that went to the best schools, that trained in the best places. That's who I want. But for the presidency, this era of the common man, the commonality of people becomes an important attribute. And so both candidates their surrogates are going to argue they're common guys. And William Henry Harrison, at age 69, a Whig, is going to be elected to the presidency. And people are going to suggest that the Whigs out-Jackson the Jacksonian Democrats. They out-democrated them, in this campaign. Harrison is 69 years old, 68 or 69, the oldest person ever to be elected to the presidency up to that point. We're going to come back to him. We're going to come back to Harrison, in a while, not today, later. Now what we want to do, once we have Harrison in office, we've kind of talked about this kind of rise of the common man, is we want to mention some of these other things that occurred during this time period. You know, this is a time where we have like a lot of change in America. One of the changes is, you know, the rise of the common man in politics. But what's happening in the United States in the aftermath of the War of 1812 is America is developing into a modern country, right? Into a modern country. You know, we don't start out as the most powerful and important country in the world. You know, I mean, we are now. You know, we're the most powerful and important country in the world, and there's no question about that. And people don't like it. You know, maybe people say, well, Iran doesn't like it, and Russia doesn't like it, and other countries don't like it, and this is not being overly patriotic. This is just stating the fact. We're the most powerful and important country in the world. We're the strongest military. We have the biggest economy, China notwithstanding. You know, we just are. You know, I mean, but we didn't start out that way. And we might not always be that way, but we are now. Right? And so the question then becomes, how did we get there? And the answer is that in the aftermath of the War of 1812, there are these trends for westward expansion, urbanization, immigration, and industrialization. And these things are going to culminate eventually in the turn of the century as America becoming the most powerful and important country in the world. But at this point, we're talking about how these things are developing. We started with the rise of the common man, and now we want to talk about westward expansion. I wish I would have put westward expansion instead of westward movement. I'm so unhappy with myself that I put westward movement rather than westward expansion. Westward expansion is a part of American history, right? From the very beginning. The settlers that came here, you know, always knew that there was an unsettled wilderness in the West. And if they were unhappy with their circumstances, they could go there. And go there relatively easily. And there they could settle on, I mean, the frontier was always there. What we're saying is that the frontier expanded quite rapidly in this time period. People moved west quite rapidly, and this westward expansion was really, really important. Now, I mean, think about it. It's what causes the Civil War. The Civil War is really, you know, a result of the debate over the expansion of slavery into Western territories. So that's what causes it. So this westward expansion, westward movement is really, really important. You know, the emergence of the West, you know, is really, really important. I mean, look, Lincoln was originally from Kentucky, right? He lived in poverty in Kentucky, and his family moved to Illinois. I mean, that was the common thing, you know, moving west. Now, part of that westward movement involved a transportation revolution. I told the other class that the AP loves this. They love the transportation revolution of the antebellum period. And the big, you know, kind of phenomenon here is that this transportation revolution enhances the connection between the West and the North, the East and the West. Now, central to the transportation revolution is steam technology, the steam engine. Let me just give this, Tanvir, let me just give it to you real quickly. Are you ready? Robert Fulton, 1807, the Clermont, the first steamboat, up the Hudson River. Keyword, up. The steamboat, right, the steam engine, and Fulton doesn't discover the steam engine. I mean, I don't even know who does. I don't like to soil my mind with math or science or anything like that. So I don't know much about technology. I don't know who does. Maybe it's Isaac Watts. Is that who? I don't know. Or did he write the Psalms or something? I don't know. But I know Fulton in the Clermont, and Fulton applies steam technology to the steamboat. The steamboat steams up the Hudson River. But this changes everything. Most rivers flow north to south. So you could transport things down the Mississippi River, but you couldn't transport them up. You know what they used to do with the Mississippi? Is they transported things down the Mississippi on rafts. When they got down to New Orleans, they just ripped the rafts apart, sold the wood. They couldn't go back up. Right? I mean, they went back up at a rate of 1 mile per hour. They would pull back up the river. It means they get big sticks and they would push their rafts up the river, and they would try and would go at 1 mile an hour. You walk at about 4 miles an hour. So if you think about walking at 1 mile an hour, you would be walking. So can you imagine how long it would take you to get freight up the river if that's how slow it was moving? I mean, it was just impractical. Here comes the steam engine. You can go up the river at 10 miles an hour. It's like stupid. You know, I mean, it changes everything. Now the east, or the north and the south are going to be connected both ways. Commerce is going to be hugely expanded. All right, that's it for today. Thank you, Mrs. Kolar. This will be on the